Good evening and welcome to Pandemic Perspectives. And I can't believe it, but it's already week 5. My name is Amy Finley and I serve as the Dean of Students. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's presentation. Tonight is the 5th installment of our exciting 6-part series, led by faculty from a variety of academic disciplines across the institution. So far, we've explored the impact of race on care, an example of the pandemic in London in the 1800s. We've learned about the virus from the perspective of epidemiology and explored the impacts of COVID-19 on older adults. As always, if you missed any of our presentations, you are welcome to go at any time onto our website to get caught up. At the conclusion of tonight's presentation, as a reminder, as we do every week, we will open up for question and answer. So please note that you can start thinking about your questions immediately and submitting them through the button at the bottom of your screen. I'd now like to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Dr. Pamela Aronson. Dr. Aronson is a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. She completed her PhD in sociology with a minor in feminist studies from the University of Minnesota. She's currently working on a book titled Gender Revolution, Politics, Me Too, and Women's Power with Matthew Fleming. She's also collecting new data for a project on sexual assault discourse and the Me Too movement with fellow UM-Dearborn colleagues, Drs. Francine Banner, Maureen Linker, and Lisa Martin, and gender self-presentations in the 2020 election, which will be in the Journal of Cultural Analysis and Social Change. Dr. Aronson's prior publications examine how social structures, including collapsing economic institutions during the Great Recession and gender, race, and class inequalities, impact identities and the life course. He has also studied the experience of disadvantaged college students, the transition to adulthood, young women's experiences of work and family, and attitudes towards feminism. Additionally, Dr. Aronson has also examined gender differences in career development, particularly the ways that family circumstances impact work orientations. At this time, I'd like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Pamela Aronson.
Thanks, Dr. Finley. I want to start by acknowledging my 2 co-authors on this project, Arnaldo Mont'Alvao at Iowa State University and Jeylan Mortimer at the University of Minnesota. And the work that I'm going to be presenting today is forthcoming in a book that's going to be published published by the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and it's specifically focused on social problems in the pandemic. So I want to, and let me just get to my title slide, which I should have done a second ago, listing my co-authors. I want to start this lecture by asking you a few questions to think about. So first of all, are you an adult? And why or why not? And secondly, what characteristics or life events make you feel that you either are or are not an adult? And finally, if you are a young adult in particular, I want to know, I mean, obviously you can't answer me this question, but given the circumstances, but I want you to think about, how's that? How the pandemic has influenced your transition to adulthood, and in particular to different adult roles. So the topics that I want to cover in this lecture are going to be starting with defining the transition to adulthood in general. And this includes both objective and subjective dimensions, which I'll explain. I'll continue by discussing some long-term historical changes in this transition, and then I'll discuss the ways in which this life phase is impacted by inequalities. I'll also then turn to the present moment to examine how the pandemic is influencing the transition to adulthood around the world. And what our research finds is essentially that nations with well spelled out, highly institutionalized pathways from school to work, and also more comprehensive social safety nets, have been better for young adults during the pandemic than nations without these supports. We also find that the pandemic is likely to increase existing inequalities. I'll continue towards the end of the presentation by discussing some policy recommendations, as well as some practical implications for young adults and also their family members, given the difficult situation that we are all facing. Okay, so turning back to the question that I started with, when I ask people to think about these questions, their responses inevitably reveal one of the main features of the transition to adulthood today. And that is that there's a great deal of complexity and ambiguity in this process. It's not entirely clear what constitutes adulthood or how we know we've gotten there. So researchers who study the transition to adulthood have argued that it's more difficult than it used to be in the past. And that this is, and what I want to make the case for today is that this is even more difficult given the pandemic. So, considering the markers or activities which indicate adult status, we can see that there are two dimensions of the transition to adulthood, both objective and subjective transitions. So the ones that are listed in this PowerPoint slide are objective transitions. In particular, they're focused on legal recognition. Objective transitions in general include things that we can point to when we look at someone else. They're formal things. The legal recognition are things like learning to drive, so that's at age 16 in Michigan, voting, which occurs at age 18, military service, also 18, and legally being able to drink alcohol, age 21. So the question to think about here is, to what extent do these things themselves constitute adulthood? So, does being able to vote make you an adult? What about being able to drive? Many people would say no to each of those questions. So given the diverse age requirement for different legal statuses, researchers have instead focused on 5 objective markers. And these 5 objective markers listed here have been typically used to determine whether or not someone has made the transition to adulthood or how far they progressed on that path. So these include finishing school, and this could be at any level. So this could be at the high school level or community college level or college level, starting full-time work, leaving the parental home, and in particular, the financial independence that accompanies that. The 4th one is getting married, and the 5th one is parenthood. So these aspects of the transition to adulthood are called transition markers. And these are really the big 5 that are typically used in studies on the transition to adulthood. However, if you think about these are somewhat confusing. So for example, is a teen parent an adult, right? This is a question. What about somebody who goes back to school later in their life? They might be an adult, but how do you take that into account? So when we think about this, we also have to realize that historical change has resulted in a very different transition to adulthood today compared to the past. And these statuses, these 5 things that I'm mentioning, vary significantly across cultures. So these transitions don't reflect also the subjective identity criteria. So things like self-sufficiency or self-reliance. So they don't really tell us whether or not people feel like adults. And so in addition to thinking about these objective indicators of adulthood, we also want to look more inside in terms of the subjective aspect. So how people feel about their own transition to adulthood. And what we find is that that aspect, the subjective aspect, is actually quite complex and confusing today. So oftentimes, the objective markers might signify adulthood when you ask people about them, but people who might have gone through some of these transitions might not actually feel like an adult. And so this is where the subjective aspect comes in. It might be an accumulation of adult roles that makes someone feel like an adult. Other studies have found that it's really more intangible, psychological, and individualistic criteria, such as feeling responsible, for example. So, as I mentioned before, the transition to adulthood has also been changing historically. In previous eras, it made quite a bit of sense to define the transition to adulthood in terms of specific markers, because life course trajectories were much more uniform than they are today. So for example, in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s and 60s, the majority of young people moved their way toward adulthood in a much more lockstep way than they do today. Today, it makes more sense to include not only these objective markers, but also how people make sense of them subjectively. So consider again the question, when do you think adulthood happens? Is it objectively determined? So by the movement into these 5 roles, for example? And if so, what's the criteria for it? Who determines it? Is it one of these more than others, for example? And if so, which ones? And then we have to think about the role of the subjective determination. That is, when do people feel like adults? And how do you know that you're an adult? What tells you that you're an adult? So I'm raising these questions because there are really no easy answers. And I'm trying to point you to the direction that there's a lot of variation in in the way people think about themselves in terms of adulthood and the way that people think about other people in terms of the transition to adulthood. And there's also a great deal of historical change and cross-cultural variation. So how has the transition to adulthood changed? How is it different from the past? Taking a long-term view. So I'm not just talking about pre and post pandemic here. We want to think about over a longer period of time, much longer period of time. So what we see is that there's more extended transitions, there's more delayed transitions. For example, there's later ages in marriage. There's also more diversity in the ages at which people make the transitions to adulthood. There's also more difficulty establishing oneself in career and finances. And many young people have indecision or delayed decision-making. There's also debt, to be honest. You know, this really impacts people's ability to make other transitions. We also know, of course, that there's lots of higher education attendance. And as people attend, let's say they go to graduate school, the longer people spend in school, the later typically other transitions happen. So we also know, and I'm not saying anything that's rocket science here, it takes a long time for young people to get established in their jobs today. And this is primarily due to long-term structural changes and also increased global competition, which have made work more unstable and more uncertain, especially for people who are currently entering the job market. So this is even before we even begin to talk about the pandemic and the economic implications of the pandemic. So this economic reality has diminished the capacity to acquire other markers of adulthood. And so what we have to think about, you know, I mentioned the 50s and 60s a minute ago, but for example, during that time period, most women were married by the age of 21 and had at least one child by the age of 23. And for men, supporting a family was the defining characteristic of adulthood. So these timelines are very different than what we have today. And in addition, there's a large percentage of people who don't complete those traditional benchmarks of becoming an adult. And according to surveys suggest, of the US surveys, the General Social Survey in particular, found that the definition of becoming adult does not include marriage or parenthood for most Americans. So marriage and parenthood are seen as optional aspects of adulthood. So to deal with some of these complexities, there is a psychologist, named Jeffrey Arnett, who came up with the concept of emerging adulthood. And so, you know, a typical adult is given legal or civil rights at age 18 to 21, but continued economic dependence on parents and continued education has led to an extension of adolescence. And so he argues that we need to think of this period as emerging adulthood, which is defined at age between 18 and 25. And this is seen as a distinct period of life. So this life phase is essentially, you can think of 3 characteristics of this life phase. Okay, the first one is demographic changes. And this includes a wide variability of roles, a lack of norms. People are doing all kinds of things in terms of school, residential status. There's lots of instability. You know, people are moving a lot. Secondly, it's also subjectively distinct. So what that means is people have left adolescence, but they may not have entered the responsibilities of adulthood. They don't see themselves subjectively as adults yet. So when you ask people on surveys, are you an adult in this age group, 18 to 20, most people say in some respects, yes, and in some respects, no. So they're sort of in between. And the last piece is identity exploration. And so this is a time for exploring possibilities in love, in work, in worldview, trying new things on, moving toward making lasting decisions, but perhaps not actually making those lasting decisions. Moving towards self-sufficiency, but not actually getting there. So for example, adolescents may view jobs as a way to obtain money, but emerging adults view jobs as a way to prepare or test out an occupation. So the advantages of this life phase of emerging adulthood is that there's lots of time for exploration, time to develop oneself, have fun, find oneself, get more prepared for adulthood. And the disadvantages is that it is hard to establish an adult identity and status. And we'll talk about in particular what happens during the pandemic and in a recession and how that impacts emerging adulthood. And in particular, there's a lot of frustration about the financial strain associated with this phase. So I'm going to talk about social class because there are many inequalities that influence this life stage. So in particular, working class and poor young adults have less access to higher education. They have less exploration because they typically have to find work. They can't rely on their parents as much to provide financial support. And we have growing inequality, deteriorating wages. And so you don't really have a lot of space to explore because there's an emphasis on needing to find work. And so in addition to that, as a result, there's often an earlier timetable for the life for folks who are poor and working class young adults. In other words, they're working at an earlier time period. They often cohabit or get married at an earlier time period as well. Okay, so that's kind of a basic theory about the transition to adulthood that I want you to come to thinking about the pandemic in, okay? So let's turn now to the transition to adulthood during COVID-19. This pandemic has pervasive implications for the transition to adulthood. As a result of significant disruptions that the pandemic has caused, youth have become increasingly vulnerable at a very critical life stage. So inequalities in the transition to adulthood, such as the ones I just mentioned, these were problematic before the pandemic, and they have deepened, unfortunately. The impacts of COVID-19 on youth across countries varies by a number of factors. It depends on cultural expectations in those countries or subcultures. It also depends on national institutional arrangements and social policy. And so what I want to examine here is how the pandemic has influenced the capacity of young people to acquire objective markers of adulthood, the ones that I just mentioned. And in particular, I'm going to focus on education, employment, and family. And I'm also going to suggest several policy changes and supports aimed at young adults that are needed to reduce the negative long-term impacts of the pandemic. Okay, so first we're going to start with education. So if you're watching this talk, chances are you had an abrupt transition, educational transition, or you know someone who has. So we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has already had vast implications for education. It redirected educational trajectories and pathways that people were on in a remarkably short period of time. The United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization estimates that more than 180 countries from all continents enforced school closures during the pandemic, affecting over 1.5 billion students, which is 90% of the world's student population. Now, this happened at all levels of the education system. So obviously we're not just talking about higher education, although higher education was affected, as were all other levels of education. Only a handful of countries, such as Sweden and Taiwan, never closed schools. This experience quickly shifted the most basic expectation in many countries around the world. That is, that youth have the capacity to anticipate and control their educational futures. The abrupt transition out of school buildings and into remote schooling required young people to adapt to remote learning of varying content and quality. While most countries tried to ensure continuing educational opportunities, their responses varied considerably by income level and region. So one report shows that among developing countries, less than 25% were able to provide continued instruction. These are low-income countries, excuse me, mostly based on TV and radio communications. While in contrast, 90% of high-income countries offered remote learning, mostly using synchronous platforms. So, developing and middle-income countries, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa, had relatively little ability to provide training and guidance for teachers. The current economic downturn and uncertainty have also wide-ranging implications for education and training going forward, from funding for secondary and post-secondary programs to young adults' ability to enroll in these programs. As nearly all technical and vocational education centers around the world closed during the pandemic, many students faced postponements or cancellations of assessment, challenging their entry into the labor market. Additionally, higher education for the first time in history has been considered a health risk that could dissuade students from attending. And this really can't be stated strongly enough. This is really the first time in history that it's actually a health risk to go to school. It's predicted that reduced enrollments will make many private US post-secondary institutions go out of business, jeopardizing even further young adults' future plans to complete their degrees. I know this is very, what's the word? Depressing. I'm going to get more depressing for a minute, and then I'll try to be optimistic at the end. So just bear with the depressing piece for a moment. In this context, it's likely that youth will lower their educational aspirations, have increasing difficulty completing school and vocational certification programs, and/or drop out due to lack of resources. And I'm talking about this because I care deeply about this issue. It's a very, very important issue and important topic that's not being discussed in the media. Typically in the media, what we're hearing is that young people are irresponsible. And I'm sort of taking that and flipping it on its head. And I want to discuss the ways that we as a society are not caring enough for young adults who need additional supports during the pandemic. Okay, so without credentials, young adults can be severely disadvantaged in the labor market. And this actually has, unfortunately, long-term implications. So research following the Great Recession found persisting difficulties for young workers around the world, even after the recession ended. A new level of economic insecurity that characterizes the current period will likely have negative consequences for educational aspirations, the ability of people to attain their degrees, even future career trajectories. There have been some studies that have focused on the well-being of young adults and the problems with that in the current pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has also already deepened educational inequalities. So its disruptions to elementary and secondary education exacerbated pre-existing racial and class inequalities in educational outcomes, leading to increasingly divergent opportunities both within and between countries. So for example, in the US, with the advent of remote instruction during the pandemic, many poor students found themselves on the other side of a very stark digital divide, that made it difficult to continue with educational programs without computers or internet access. At the college level, loss of employment among those who were both working on campus and off campus has had a series of negative repercussions, especially affecting disadvantaged students. A recent study of a large sample of US post-secondary students during the early stage of the pandemic found substantial food insecurity, housing insecurity, and also anxiety. Students of color were found to experience much more insecurity with respect to basic needs than white students. And young people may also be dealing with and experiencing parental job loss, or the demands of caring for siblings while their parents work, or financial insecurity in the household. People of color in the US have been disproportionately negatively impacted by illness and unemployment during the current crisis, and financial stressors in their families of origin have likely impacted the ability of young people to keep up with their schoolwork. Another concern, especially in developing countries, is that the pandemic could reverse educational gains for young girls that have occurred over the past few decades. So for example, in countries affected by the Ebola crisis in 2014, such as Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, temporary school closures led to increases in domestic responsibilities and limited time available for learning from home, which led many girls to drop out of school. So as a result, increased achievement gaps by socioeconomic origin and gender and ethnicity and race are all likely. So I want to talk about some policy recommendations, and this is specifically focused on education. So while strengthening the safety net in general will help these problems, young adults who are coming of age in pandemic times will need specific educational supports. It's particularly important that these are targeted for disadvantaged populations. So increased resources for post-secondary education are needed, as families, especially those who are the most vulnerable, will be unable to shoulder the high cost of tuition. So in some countries, such as Germany, Sweden, Argentina, and Egypt, higher education is tuition free. And in many others, like the US, also Great Britain, Japan, and Chile, college tuition can be a very formidable expenditure for most families. I'm telling you something that you already know. But enhanced governmental resources for post-secondary education in the latter countries, including in the US, are now very necessary, as increasing numbers of families have become unable to shoulder the high costs of attendance, especially given everything else that's happening with job loss and things in the economic issues that we're facing. One policy that the US provides and how post-secondary students in immediate need have received assistance is through the CARES Act. And another proposed program in Michigan is modeled after the GI Bill following World War II, in which essential workers without a post-secondary degree, including frontline workers, grocery store employees, and those in trash collection, could attend higher education institutions tuition free. Now, again, this is a proposal. It's not actually a law yet, so don't get too excited about it. But at the same time, we need to also think about basic needs support, which should be expanded in many countries, including the US, so that post-secondary students do not experience food and housing insecurity, and they also know how to access the resources that they're qualified for. So there's a lot of possible policy areas. I'm going to turn to employment now. So over the last 2 decades, youth labor market prospects had deteriorated considerably around the world. So this is, again, not related to the pandemic. Youth unemployment was already high in 2019. The pandemic has further jeopardized young people's entry and establishment in the workforce. The International Labor Organization estimates that more than 1 in 6 young people lost their jobs during the pandemic, and those with jobs had their hours reduced by nearly 25%. In many countries, initial restrictions shut down major industries such as restaurant, hospitality, the retail sector, and these are industries that typically employ large numbers of young people. In the US, among workers under 25, nearly half work in high-risk sectors. So without national protections with respect to unemployment, as in Germany, joblessness, we know, approached the Great Depression levels in many countries, the US included, and youth were especially hard hit by these job losses. Job losses among young Europeans were 3 times higher than older adults. In countries like Spain and Greece, where youth unemployment has remained over 30% since the Great Recession, that is of 2007 to 8, the pandemic could drive unemployment to over 40%. So youth have been forced to reconsider their career goals in light of this, the collapse of the job market or near collapse. Often that dream job is hard to obtain. There's a lot of people who are working in the informal economy. In the developing world, they're working in gig employment facilitated by advanced technologies in order to pay their bills. Young women's job prospects are expected to be more affected than those of men worldwide, considering their greater likelihood of employment in the informal sector or in high-risk occupations in lower and middle-income countries. Even before the pandemic, worldwide NEET, N-E-E-T, which means not in education, employment, or training, so those are people who are not doing any of those things, rates were very high among young women, 31%, more so than young men, which was 14%. So the pandemic, by creating training and employment obstacles, could accelerate this trend. So obviously, if we're talking about, we have been talking about unemployment, but I want to tell you a little bit more about that. So the lack of institutionalized bridges from school to work in some countries, such as the United States, China, and Brazil, makes job entry particularly challenging, even in good economic times. So unlike a country like Germany, which has strong apprenticeship system, and so for example, unemployment rates in the pandemic in Germany hovered around 5%. Young people in countries like the US, China, Brazil faced definitely a harsh reality. So in the US, the youth unemployment rate more than doubled between January 2020, when it was 11.7%, and April 2020, when it was 25.5%. In China, with millions of new graduates entering the labor market each year, approximately 14% of youth labor force participants were out of jobs during the pandemic. For young people in Brazil, the pandemic was the second recession in less than 5 years. In 2017, during the peak of the first recession, the youth unemployment rate reached 30%. It has only marginally receded since then. So the pandemic drove an increasing share of young workers to the informal sector, where underemployment is prevalent. So the current cohort of young people will be more strongly affected by the current health and economic crisis than cohorts that come after them. So in other words, it's a particular generation that will be affected, and people who are younger will be less affected. The sudden widespread unemployment and income loss among so many of their parents has reduced the ability of parents to help their children in ways that are typical during better economic times. So it could be by financing some or all of their post-secondary education, so that their children could wait out the recession while heightening their credentials, getting a degree, for example. Or parents sometimes were able to help young people by helping them find jobs with their own or other employers. So in coming years, the present cohort of youth who are transitioning into adulthood will unfortunately be competing with new workforce entrants who are less likely to have extensive post-education unemployment gaps in their resumes. So it's not good news. I do want to suggest some policy recommendations. So in countries without strong linkages between work and school, most young people find jobs through personal networks, online, or using other sources of information, or via direct application to employers. So this structural context is especially detrimental when recessions strike, when the potential to widen the gap between more and less advantaged youth occurs. So as job opportunities worsen, those entering the workforce with only a high school diploma or less, or even those who spend some time in college without receiving a degree, must largely fend for themselves. In contrast, those with the highest educational qualifications after graduating from a four-year college or university can rely on institution-sponsored job fairs and career services to help them find work. Parents of youth from affluent families are the most able to draw on personal networks to locate employment for their young adult children. So, like the changes wrought by COVID-19 in education, its ramifications for work will surely heighten existing inequalities. As in prior recessions, people of color have been disproportionately impacted by unemployment. Many youth employed in essential businesses at the start of the pandemic continued to work despite high risks of infection, while those in non-essential organizations experience layoffs. So the degree of difficulty youth experience as they enter the workforce is also likely to affect their confidence in ways that increase inequality. These problems may harm youth's optimism and also their sense of control over their lives. So as a result, one of the things that we have to think about is the way that disadvantaged young people may be less likely to have a positive outlook that promotes what's called agentic striving. So this includes high aspirations and a commitment to career goals, which would help them avoid unemployment, even in a depressed job market. So these are more favorably situated, those who are more favorably situated. So those people who have more resources are going to face less obstacles and possibly might be able to bounce back a little easier, be more resilient. So considering all of this, there are a lot of policy implications. So policies that have been designed to diminish the recessionary effects of the pandemic and its consequences for young people vary considerably across countries. Many European countries nationalized payrolls and subsidized wages, and the US expanded unemployment benefits. So as a consequence, European policies were more effective, I should say, at providing quick access to subsidized wages. They helped to mitigate the immediate effect of the pandemic on young people. In the UK, for example, thanks to these policies, furloughs were more prevalent, 24%, than actual job losses, which were only 9% among young people. In the US, however, unemployment increased considerably, and unemployed workers face delays in access to benefits that are only temporary. Many self-employed workers in Brazil faced a similar situation, struggling to gain access to programs implemented to support them during the pandemic, while unemployment soared. New policies are needed desperately to build pathways between school and work, especially for those who have fewer financial resources. So with that in mind, the UK government, for example, is proposing the creation of a fund to support 6-month job placements for unemployed young people, and youth in some other countries, such as here, would certainly benefit from similar programs. Okay, I'm not going to talk about leaving home and family formation for as long as the other two transitions, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. So the COVID-19 pandemic has threatened the capacity of young people to leave home and form families of their own. Because finishing school and getting a full-time job, stable employment are generally essential prerequisites for family formation. So without a stable income, The future may look uncertain for people to responsibly commit to even a romantic relationship, or to assume the financial investments that beginning a family life might entail, like wedding costs, mortgage down payments, or the considerable expense of having children. So at an age when young adults are expected to be on their own, gaining independence from parents and forging new identities, for example, many students had to return abruptly to their families of origin. Those who were in post-secondary education, in dorms in particular, when the pandemic hit, were immediately forced to move out of their dorms or off-campus housing. Youth who were employed in non-essential businesses sometimes lost their sources of income when they had to move, which had difficulty paying rent. Many people had to return home for those reasons. In the US, nearly 80%, or I should say 80% of the nearly 3 million people who had to move back into their parents' home at the onset of the pandemic were young adults. So there were people who are not young adults who had to move back home, but the vast majority of those who did move back in with parents were young adults. And in fact, the proportion of youth living with parents increased in the US to historic levels, as nearly 60% of those between 18 and 25 moved back in with their parents. Similar trends were observed during the last decade in countries where living with parents has been more normative for young people, such as in Southern Europe. While some families adjusted comfortably to this new togetherness, others reported that there was lots of strain and difficulty and that the situation was not satisfactory. So returning home could be difficult for many people who have only recently assumed some autonomy. For example, during the time that they resided away from home, many youth may have changed in ways that are not to their parents' liking. They may be exposed to new ideas, new people, especially those who went away to college. They may have different worldviews than their parents, different political leanings, different religious beliefs. And so a lot of these things may have created some tension when they moved home. So for many also who were living independently and then moved back home, the resumption of the role of child may be difficult, and in particular, causing people to revert to prior relational patterns with parents assigning chores like they did when their children were teenagers. In many families, parents' concerns about their children's risk of COVID-19 infection probably outweighed those of their children. There have been lots of reports that infected youth were more likely than older adults to be asymptomatic or to experience only moderate illness or mild illness. Given the disparate perceptions of risk, so of going to restaurants or hanging out with friends, as state restrictions loosened, conflicts likely ensued. So, for instance, in the pre-COVID-19 era, parents may have been wary of their children going to bars or bar hopping, but such behavior took on a whole new meaning with the highly contagious character of the COVID-19 context and the potential transference of infection from young adults to more vulnerable older relatives. The pandemic and the associated flow of young adults back to the family home is linked to delays in family formation and home ownership. So romantic relationships may be jeopardized, may be difficult under mandates that people shelter in place. Youth whose romantic partners were not living with them prior to the pandemic would not be able to see them face to face without violating stay-at-home orders. Certainly video chatting lets people stay in touch, but as we know, those remote options are probably less satisfying than in-person contact. So there's a lot of questions about how the accumulation of these issues might have affected young adults' relationships, also family, relationships with friends, but we're talking about romantic partners right now. So disrupting or slowing the course of these relationships could delay cohabitation, which, especially in the US, precedes marriage, and also in many other countries as well as marriage itself. So when we think about what happened during the last recession, which was the Great Recession, 2007 to 2008, young people during that period were not able to become homeowners to the same extent. They also delayed starting families at the same rate as their parents' generation. So they actually had less wealth accumulation over time. There was a decline in home ownership. I know I'm painting a bleak picture here. So the other thing that happens in recessions typically is that birth rates fall. Given the greater economic uncertainty of the present context, many young adults may put off parenthood, may put off marriage, and this may influence their ability to attain their desired family size. So when we think about this from a societal perspective, if there's a reduction in birth rates and you have an aging society, it reduces the number of working age adults who are able to support financially elderly people. It also limits consumer demand that actually fuels many advanced capitalist economies. So we're going to think about some policies too here. And really we need to think about policies that are targeted to young adults to help young people solidify their establishment in the world of work, because that will help to ensure viability in family life as romantic partners, as spouses, as parents, and as improving conditions for home ownership. So these things are especially important for disadvantaged youth whose educational credentials, if they're interrupted, could reduce their capacity to obtain a job with a sufficient income to enable home leaving and family formation. So one policy that has come out in Singapore is government-sponsored housing programs, which have helped young people to acquire starter homes. The absence of similar programs in many Western countries is a problem. So we have to think about relieving young adult economic insecurity first by instituting living wages, strengthening the safety net, and also making publicly provided childcare and after-school care widely available. Although, of course, now many things are remote. It's hard. We have to think about the future, not just what's happening right this second. These things would be able to help young people achieve family-related markers of adulthood. Okay. So I'm going to turn to some conclusions. And I want to kind of stress the fact that this presentation has, probably with as many of the presentations on the pandemic, have focused on a lot of the negative pieces of the pandemic and how it's affecting young adults in a negative way. What I want to say here too is that young adults have been very creative about how they've dealt with a lot of the stressors that they've encountered. There's incredible accounts of, Zoom happy hours, when the mandates were in order, social distancing, gatherings, and Facebook support groups and social media support groups, which have become a lifeline for a lot of people. But that said, the monumental difficulties that young adults are facing at this very critical time in their lives, when their family, education, and work-related choices and behaviors are highly consequential for their future lives, means that we need more social policy. And in particular, what I want to suggest is that this needs to address the unique needs of young adults. It's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of situation where policies that are geared towards everybody, that can also be helpful. But so these are things that would be helpful for everybody: universal health care, right? Basic needs programs. But I'm also talking about things that are specifically targeted towards young adults that would help young adults in particular make the transition to adulthood during this very difficult time that we're living in. And in particular, this will be especially important for disadvantaged youth and young adults, including young women, racial and ethnic minorities, those from working class or poor families, as well as young adults in low-income countries. So, in order to address these unique challenges and needs, there are certainly things that can be done. So what we found in our research is that countries with subsidized wage programs and more formalized links between school and work have helped to mitigate the negative economic effect of the pandemic recession and have allowed young adults to enter furloughs where their jobs were temporarily suspended instead of encountering job loss. With social policy support such as this, young people will be more likely to be able to complete their education, to attain stable work, to leave home, to establish families of their own, and eventually to invest in the next generation of societal members by having kids. So I want to offer some suggestions for young people in particular, and also their families, given these difficult circumstances. One suggestion, so this is just beyond the policy, just thinking about it as an individual. So you've heard this kind of overall negative picture. But there are things that people can do as individuals. Hopefully we'll get some more policies that will address people's needs, but there are also individual things that people can do. And so one suggestion is to continue your education. The popular media has offered examples of young people, mainly privileged young adults, who are taking a gap year in higher education. This is actually not the best strategy. Previous research suggests that time away from college significantly decreases the likelihood that students will actually finish. A better strategy is to wait out the recession by focusing on higher education to the extent that it's possible. So in the long run, in other words, students are better served by completing their degrees and or going on to graduate school. If you as an individual are taking classes and you experience difficulties with your studies, there are a lot of ways, there are a lot of university supports that you can turn to. You can reach out to professors, advisors, Dr. Finley is the Dean of Students, and there's a lot of problem solving that the institution can do. So this brings me to another suggestion, which is to make sure that you're utilizing to the fullest extent possible all of the financial supports available to you. In a recent study, scholars found that many students did not know that they qualified for different types of supports. For example, the CARE Act funding. Many students who were eligible for unemployment insurance did not apply for it or even know that they were eligible. Many students may be eligible for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, the food program, but they don't know how to apply. So it's important to do a lot of research on this topic to get support when you need it. And I also want to offer some suggestions for family members who themselves are likely under a great deal of stress resulting from the pandemic. And so my suggestions are to be as understanding as you can about the challenges facing the young adults in your family. So this is a difficult time for all of us, and it's important to keep in mind that it might be actually more difficult for young people who faced an incredible level of disruption resulting from the pandemic. So the times ahead will not be easy, and they will stress even the most solid of child-parent relationships. But most of the time, we're all doing our best. And so I'm going to leave it there. My contact information is here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Finley for questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I hope everybody really enjoyed that and learned a lot. I know we got a lot of questions that have come in through the Q&A. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. So Dr. Aronson, you talked quite a bit about different resources that are available, and I'm pretty familiar with some of those, but do you want to share just a few of those resources that are available to students?
Yes, thanks, Dr. Finley. I actually originally had this in the talk, and I moved it to the end so I can actually show you a few here. So I have these grouped into a few different categories. This list is not comprehensive, but it does include some important ones. There are a lot of financial resources available. I mentioned the CARES Act, which is the top one, and this provides financial assistance to those who've been adversely impacted by the disruption of campus operations caused by COVID-19. And all students are eligible for that if they have a valid FAFSA. There is still time to file, and we're enrolled in a program that met on campus prior to the transition to remote delivery. Unfortunately, international students are not eligible for that funding, but both domestic and international students are eligible for the Student Immediate Relief Fund. There's a new Get to Graduation Fund. There is also a UM-Dearborn Student Food Pantry, which I'm understanding has not been utilized very much recently. And you don't have to go in. The UM-Dearborn packs the food and brings it to your car. There are going to be masks available on campus for students who need them. So there's a lot of resources. There's others. These are just some of the ones that have been highlighted. And there's also other kinds of resources. There's mental health resources available on campus. There's actually an email and phone line that you can call or email to discuss concerns that you have. They can help you to kind of route your concerns. Other things, peer mentoring, there's technology available on campus, etc.
Great, thank you. So, this is a little bit of an emergent area as we think about transition during pandemic. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe what you're thinking about for a future research agenda?
So one of the things I'm really interested in, I know that I painted a pretty bleak picture today, but one of the things I'm also interested in is the way that young adults creatively respond to difficult circumstances. And so with a student of mine, Islam Jaffel, we're going to be looking at the Facebook group called Zoom Memes for Self-Quarantines, TEENS. And in my initial following of this group, I'm a member of the group, I noticed that there was a lot of, documenting the shock and the horror that we all faced and experienced, as well as the evolving response to the pandemic. And this all happened in a humorous way. And the use of memes and social media is a very positive coping mechanism in times of stress for young adults. And so one of the things I'm interested in is how that social support played itself out over the course of the pandemic.
Okay, so our next question, if more financial support was available, do you think that young people would be more likely to spend additional time pursuing higher education? So would they go maybe more likely to go full time or pursue other interests?
Absolutely. The number one barrier to the completion of a degree and to pursuing a degree full time is the financial barrier. So if we were to, and in fact, if you do a cross-national comparison, you can see that nations that have significant supports, such as free tuition, are not experiencing the same kind of stressors that we have in the US, where this cost gets passed on to students and their families.
So do you expect then that there would be any change? Will this cause, we know pandemic is making people think differently about lots of different things. Do you think that this will cause any great shift in the funding of higher education or in the way that students pay for higher education?
I think that that's really going to depend on the policies going forward. If we continue in the current situation, we have, higher education, I'll just say this, higher education is facing a financial crisis right now across the board. Public schools, universities, public universities, private universities, all education is facing a financial crisis right now. Because for the public institutions, they're funded by, they rely a lot on state funding, and we don't really know how that's gonna play itself out even this next year, the next fiscal year for the state. And so we don't know how it's going to play itself out. The more public support we have for higher education, the better it is for people who want to attend. The less they have to pay on their own.
So switching gears just a little bit, with all the variation involved in defining adulthood, would it be better to view the transition to adulthood as a spectrum?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. The transition to adulthood is a very, very diverse time. The only thing about a spectrum, I like that idea, it's a good metaphor. The only thing I don't love about it is that there's so much variation within the different transitions as well. And so it's not just that, so in other words, someone might be very far along in terms of one area, but not so much on the other. And that can vary based on the spheres of life. So someone might be far along in education, but not so far along in terms of work. But I definitely think that's a useful way to think about it. I like that metaphor.
So this question kind of goes the other way, and it says, what are your thoughts about defining adulthood biologically? I have read some studies that say the rational part of the brain is not fully developed until age 25. Could this be another consideration in that equation?
So certainly emerging adulthood is the period between 18 to 25. And part of the reason is that, yes, the brain is more developed at a certain time period. However, because I'm a sociologist, I feel very strongly that the social roles that people take on are more important than biology. Not that there's no biological basis, but there's ambiguity in that as well, in that people develop at different paces. How do you know if the brain is actually fully developed? So I'm a little, it could certainly be a factor, but I wouldn't say that it would be the major factor.
So pandemic or not, are there other examples of times in history when there were great disturbances to transition to adulthood? So, maybe that is a previous pandemic, or maybe that's a war. Are there other examples that we can point to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in particular, typically when sociologists consider this, they look at economic disruption, right? So the pandemic is a health crisis. And so, but it has economic implications, of course. And so I would really say, like, for example, the Great Recession, or the Great Depression, excuse me. Great Recession is like history. We don't even know what that we use that term prematurely. But the Great Depression, for example, was a time period when people did not have the financial resources to move out on their own. They did not have the financial resources to get married. And so what's really interesting is that prior to the Depression, ages at marriage were lower. In the Great Depression, they actually rose. So we think of like history, like, oh, back in the day, people got married young. It's not that way. There's fluctuation in these things. So during a recession, it's much harder to establish oneself as an adult. And that's something that we know from other recessions as well.
So why do you think there's been such a historical shift in the accepted age of adulthood? In the early US, it seems adulthood was based more on puberty. So was that due to simply a shorter lifespan or something else? And what changed or led this change to the apparently ever increasing culturally accepted age?
Well, I think it's a combination of changing life expectancy. Certainly that does have a role. As we live for longer and longer time periods, right? Older and older ages, we're more likely to spend longer years developing ourselves. But also we have to look at, a lot of the things that have happened in the post-industrial age. And so it takes a long time right now for youth to learn marketable skills. And so when we think about sort of, because really more recently, it's been longer and longer time periods that it takes for people to transition to adulthood or to feel fully adult. And this is really one of the big reasons why, that as our economy shifts, it takes longer for us to be able to get that training that we need to be able to establish a family, to be able to have that financial resources.
So this will be our last question based on timing, but can you talk a little bit about, are there any particular areas, regions of the country, regions of the world where you think there are policies in place that really support young adults best? And if so, what are those policies, or what are those sort of influencers that really support young adults best?
Yeah, so I think if we're thinking about in general, countries that have lots of social supports generally have better supports for the transition to adulthood. But in particular, I would target, or I would like to think about countries that have very formalized linkages between school and employment. So for example, Germany has a very large apprenticeship program. And what happens in that nation is that, you know, people don't leave their education and flounder around for a long time. They really get matched with someone who's going to be their mentor and teach them how they're going to, you know, do a particular job. And so what you have in that situation is a lot of support for moving into these roles. Less so in the US. We're a little bit more, we lack those formal mechanisms that connect education to employment.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Aronson. That concludes the formal part of tonight's presentation. Just a few moments going over some housekeeping details. Again, the link that you use to access tonight's presentation will be the same link that you will use next week to access our course. As I said earlier, all presentations are recorded and the recordings are available to you at any time on our website. Tonight's presentation should be there within 24 hours. In the Canvas site, as is every week, students will find a 5-question quiz. Please be sure to take the quiz no later than next Monday night at 11:59 p.m. To earn credit, you must participate in the sessions, complete the quizzes, and then complete the reflection assignment. So I want to make note that the reflection assignment is available in Canvas, so this is a good time to make sure you review the directions of the reflection, which of course is a required part of our course. That's all in Canvas for you, and do let us know if you have any questions. Finally, I would just invite you, for those of you who may not be joining us for credit, to come and enjoy and learn with us again next week. Our final presentation next week will be Dr. Natalie Sampson, who will partner with Justin Onwenu of the Detroit Sierra Club. Their talk will explore how COVID-19 layers on top of a longtime crisis of environmental health inequity in the United States. For example, how frontline communities of color or with low income are more likely to live adjacent to industrial freight and hazardous waste sites as sources of chemical and non-chemical exposure, and experience higher rates of associated morbidity and premature mortality. While COVID-19 may lead to temporary declines in the global air pollution, we contend, or they contend, how environmental health inequities will persist in major cities without the reimagining of broader social, environmental, and economic policies. Do join us next week. Good night.